the address, I want to thank His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales, for delivering the address this morning. And I too want to pay tribute to Her Majesty in the year of her Platinum Jubilee. Her dedication to Britain has been a reassuring constant in an ever-changing world. Her commitment to public duty, a reminder of the responsibilities we all owe each other. Her dignity and her leadership, an inspiration to all of us. She will forever have all of our thanks for 70 years of service to our country. We all wish her well. I also want to congratulate the Prime Minister. He's achieved a new first. The first resident of Downing Street to be a constituent of a Labour council. I'm sure they will serve him. And I want to congratulate, Mr. Speaker, I want to congratulate the mover and the seconder on their fine and funny speeches. I understand that the member for Beverley and Holderness owns over 900 copies of Eagle comic books. He's no old duffer. He is an extensive collector of the adventures of Dan Dare from the Interplanet Patrol, a comic book with a hero with a moral message, a spirit that he's channeled into his 17 years in this House.
That's how you do it.
Although there is some mischief in him, as he's just demonstrated in his speech. I particularly liked his advice that you should make an enemy of your party leader. So I think he's a little bit more Dennis the Menace, myself. The member for Brecon and Radnorshire is dedicated not only to, obviously, a punishing consultation exercise on what to put in the speech for today, but also a punishing exercise regime. A former cox with Twickenham Rowing Club, a half-marathon runner, and even an Ironman competitor. Maybe she's an Iron Lady in the making. And I know that if they were here, David Amis and James Brokenshire would have been proud of both the mover and the seconder. We all missed them both. And I know the pain on the Conservative benches is still raw. Their friends taken too soon. But their passing leaves us united in our resolve to defeat the evils of both extremism and cancer. I also want to pay tribute to my dear friend Jack Dromey. Jack picked fights on behalf of working people, and he won them. In 1975, he led the first Equal Pay Act strike. He campaigned for the rights of cleaners everywhere, from the House of Commons to MI5. And in the last year of his life, he campaigned for a public inquiry on behalf of the families bereaved by COVID. The only way that we on these benches can really pay tribute to Jack is to aspire to champion working people as well as he did. Because, Mr. Speaker, times are hard, but they're much tougher than they should be. As we emerge from the pandemic, find a new place in the world outside the European Union and transition to a carbon-neutral economy, our country faces great challenges. But at the same time, great opportunities are within our reach. We can rebuild stronger, learning where our society and our services need more resilience. We can do more than just get Brexit done. We can ensure Britain is in the best position to thrive outside of the European Union. And we can lead the world in zero-carbon industries, generating high-skilled, high-wage jobs across the country. But, Mr. Speaker, for that to happen, we need a government of the moment, with the ideas that meet the aspirations of the British public. This thin address, bereft of ideas or purpose, without a guiding principle or a roadmap for delivery, shows just how far this government is from that. Too out of touch to meet the challenges of the moment, too tired to grasp the opportunities of the future. Their time has passed. Mr. Speaker, the first great challenge our country faces is the cost of living crisis. Inflation stands at 7% and rising. Household bills have gone up by hundreds of pounds. The cost of the weekly shop has rocketed, and people are seeing their wages run out much earlier in the month and the value of their savings fall. I wish I could say that the worst is over. But last Thursday, the Bank of England revised down Britain's growth and revised up inflation. This government's failure to grow the economy over a decade, combined with its inertia in the face of spiralling bills, means that we are staring down the barrel of something we haven't seen in decades, a stagflation crisis. It is a truly shocking legacy of this government. It should humble those on the benches opposite who've ignored the red lights on our economy, even whilst wages were frozen for over a decade, and whose complacency is best summed up by a Prime Minister whose response to the crisis was to make fun of those that were worrying about inflation. A government of the moment would use the great powers that it has to tackle this head-on. Bring forward an emergency budget with a windfall tax for oil and gas producers, which would raise billions. The money that could be used to slash the cost of energy bills and help businesses keep their costs down. Even the bosses at BP don't agree when the Prime Minister says it would deter investment. It's a common-sense solution. But instead, the government is bereft of leadership. The Chancellor ruling the windfall tax in, the Business Secretary ruling it out, and a Prime Minister who doesn't know what he thinks. And it's not just about the short-term measures. A government of the moment would take a step back from the crisis and ensure that Britain is never again so vulnerable to a surge in international prices, forced to go cap in hand from dictator to dictator, looking for a quick fix of imported oil. That means standing up to those vested interests who oppose onshore wind, the cheapest and most reliable source of electricity that we have. But this Prime Minister is too weak to stand up to his backbenchers. And it means investing in the insulation we need to use less energy in our homes. That would take £400 off energy bills every year and cut gas imports by 15%. But this Prime Minister is far too concerned with vanity projects ever to prioritise investment in insulating homes. So we're left with an energy bill not up to the moment. It's the latest chapter in a pathetic response to the cost of living crisis. Where there should have been support, it's been tax rise after tax rise on working people. The only country in the G7 to do so during a cost of living crisis. The low growth that led to the stagnation we see today is the same reason wages have been frozen for so long. Over 12 years of Tory government, the economy has grown far slower than when Labour was in power, and it's set to go even slower in coming years. The slowest growing economy in the G7 next year. As the Director General of the CBI said, for a country that's used to growth of 2 to 2.5%, the Conservative record is simply not good enough. Mr. Speaker, we can't afford to go on like this. If the Tories had simply matched Labour's record on growth in government, people would have had higher incomes, boosting public finances, and we could have spent £40 billion more on public services without having to raise a single tax. So the second great challenge our country faces is to get Britain growing again. A government of the moment would have grasped the nettle and set out a new approach to the economy. an approach based on a stronger partnership between government and businesses, a partnership dedicated to growth. There would have been an industrial strategy to grow the industries of the future, with the government providing initial investment that brings confidence and security and acts as a catalyst for the private sector to invest in gigafactories, hydrogen and steel. High productivity jobs right here in Britain. A government at the moment would finally abolish business rates and replace them with a fair system that creates a level playing field with online giants so that our businesses can compete, invest and grow. And a government of the moment would have a plan to revive our town centres and new businesses, providing finance for a new generation of start-ups in our town centres, giving councils the power to take over empty shops and fill the space with workshops and offices in the jobs of the future. Instead of that new approach to the economy, we have a Chancellor who thinks it would be silly to do anything different. A Chancellor who, rather than partnering with business, has loaded them up with debt and wonders why they're struggling to invest. A Chancellor who seems content to have the slowest growth of any G20 country, bar one, Russia. A Chancellor whose legacy will be low growth, high inflation and high tax, and with it the diminishing of Britain's living standards. No hope of taking on the big challenges, no hope of seizing the great opportunities. Hopeless. And because they're not up to the challenge of growing the economy, all those tax hikes aren't going into improving public services. No chance of a doctor's appointment. People forced to wait months for urgent mental health treatment. Supersized classrooms the norm again. Never before have people been asked to pay so much for so little. And, Mr. Speaker, the third great challenge we face is ending the poverty of ambition this government has for our public services. That means a government at the moment relentlessly focused on school improvement. Labour would improve leadership and teaching standards at state schools, funding it by ending tax breaks for private schools. It means a government of the moment that would finally deliver world-class mental health provision that matches years of empty rhetoric on parity with physical health. Labour would hire new clinicians so we can guarantee mental health treatment in 4 weeks, paid for by closing loopholes to private equity firms. Instead, we have a government that went into the pandemic with record waiting lists and has got no plan to get them down any time soon. A government that takes the public for fools by pretending that refurbishing a hospital, a wing of a hospital, is the same as building a new hospital. A government that can't hire the GPs it promised or the GPs we have to see more patients. Lost in spin, no ambition, not up to the challenge of the moment. And it's not just education and health that needs reform. Fraud has become commonplace. 7 million incidents a year. Britain routinely ripped off. But the business sector has suggested it doesn't even count as crime. The fraud is just the tip of the iceberg. Victims are being let down whilst this government lets violent criminals off. The overall charge rate stands at a pathetic 5.8%, meaning that huge swathes of serious offences like rape, knife crime and theft have effectively been decriminalised. A government of the moment would say enough is enough. Invest in community policing. Pulling resources, nobody can be proud of this record of 12 years. Invest in community policing, pulling resources away from vanity projects like his ministerial yacht. It would strengthen protection for victims of crime and antisocial behaviour and increase the number of specialist rape units in the justice system so that it stops routinely failing women. Instead, we have a government that talks tough whilst letting the justice system fall apart.
Exactly.
No care for victims or their communities, not good enough, not up to the moment. We have a government whose time has passed, a cabinet out of ideas and out of energy, led by a Prime Minister who's entirely out of touch. Mr. Speaker, it doesn't have to be this way. It won't always be this way. A Labour government would tackle the cost of living crisis head on. Get Britain growing again after 12 years of failure. Improve public services so they deliver for people paying for them. A Labour government would rise to the moment where this government has badly failed. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister Boris Johnson.
Mr. Speaker, allow me to join you and members across this House in thanking His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales, for delivering the gracious speech, and in sending our warmest wishes to Her Majesty the Queen. The whole House knows the reluctance with which Her Majesty made today's decision, and her extraordinary service to this nation continues to inspire us all. Mr. Speaker, as we come to the halfway point of this Parliament, this country has seen off the biggest challenge any post-war government has faced, but the cost of the pandemic has been huge, with the biggest fall in output for 300 years, the necessitated government expenditure of £400 billion. And the aftershocks are still being felt across the world, with a global spike in energy prices, the impact we're seeing on the cost of food. And it's precisely because this government got the big calls right and made the tough decisions during the pandemic that we had the fastest economic growth in the G7 last year, and will return to that status, by the way, by 2024, Mr. Speaker, and therefore have the fiscal firepower to help families up and down the country with all the pressures they face now. And we will continue to use all our ingenuity and compassion for as long as it takes. And my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, and I will be saying more about this in the days to come. But at the same time as we help people, we need the legislative firepower to fix the underlying problems in energy supply, in housing, in infrastructure and in skills, which are driving up costs for families across the country. And this Queen's speech takes those issues head on. And above all, we're tackling the economic challenges with the best solution of all, and that's an ever-growing number of high-wage, high-skill jobs, Mr. Speaker. Jobs, jobs, jobs. And we drive up employment by creating the right platform for business to invest. Making our streets safer, 20,000 more police, creating a healthier population, 50,000 more nurses, funding the NHS to help them clear the COVID backlogs, and giving the confidence that people know that they will be looked after in old age by fixing social care. Delivering gigabit broadband, giving the remotest parts of the country the access that they need, and using our Brexit freedoms to enable revolutionary technologies like gene editing to help our farmers grow more nutritious and more productive crops. And it's that combination of public and private sector together that is tackling unemployment, with 500,000 people more on the payroll now than before the pandemic began. And it is that strength at home that enables this country to show leadership abroad, as we have done and will continue to do in supporting the people of Ukraine. So this Queen's speech delivers on our promises. It will not only take us through the aftershocks of COVID, but build the foundations for decades of prosperity, uniting and levelling up across the country. Mr. Speaker, allow me to join the Leader of the Opposition in paying tribute to those colleagues we've lost in this parliamentary session. And time will not dim our shock at the despicable murder of Sir David Amess, a friend to so many, who lost his life giving the service he loved most, a constituency surgery in a local church. And among the many legacies of Sir David, which include his amazing work on animal welfare, his campaign to support women with endometriosis, I'm proud to say that today Southend-on-Sea stands as a city in his tribute. Yesterday we gathered at St Margaret's Church to remember James Brokenshire, a true gentleman who faced his battle with cancer with enormous courage, generosity and strength of character. It was typical of our dear friend that even in the midst of his own battle, he was supporting and encouraging others to seek help, campaigning for better lung cancer screening and becoming the first MP to secure a debate on the issue on the floor of this House. We willed him to pull through because the world needs more people in public life like him. His loss is felt deeply on all sides of this House and by all those whose lives he touched. Finally, we began the year by joining the Right Honourable Member for Camberwell and Peckham in paying tribute to her wonderful husband, Jack Dromey, one of the great trade unionists of our time, who, having married someone who would go on to become, in his words, the outstanding parliamentary feminist of her generation, will also be forever remembered, in his words, as Mr. Harriet Harman, née Dromey. We all knew him as a man of great warmth, energy and compassion, and he commanded the utmost respect across this House. Mr. Speaker, the gracious speech was magnificently proposed. Self-deprecating, I thought, by my honourable friend, the member for Beverley and Holderness, whose campaigning brilliance I have seen at first hand, as he pointed out, when as backbenchers almost 20 years ago, he and I organised a demonstration against Labour's plan to close community hospitals. It was called Chant, Community Hospitals Acting Nationally Together. And his memory of it is much more glorious than mine. I remember only a tiny handful of desperadoes. We were stopped almost immediately by the police, Mr. Speaker, who turned us back. But he nonetheless succeeded in forcing the government to perform, the then Labour government, I should stress, to perform on the funding for community hospitals, and as a great speaker, 48 of them, in fact. So we have the best health service in the world. I know, by the way, that he has experience of healthcare in a less fortunate country. He was lying in bed with a fractured rib after a skiing accident in Chamonix, when 3 men in white coats arrived, claiming that they were there to perform the operation. And on closer inspection, they turned out to be the members for Halton, Price and Howden, the member for Sutton Coldfield, and my honourable friend, my noble friend, Lord Lancaster. At which point it is said that my honourable friend levitated miraculously from his bed and made his escape. His speech was in the finest traditions of this House. I was delighted that the motion was seconded by my honourable friend, the member for Brecon and Radnorshire. Yeah. Some more seasoned members will remember the 14 years of service rendered to the people of Cardiff North by her father, Gwilym, who joins us, I'm told, in the gallery today. Delighted to see him there, and I'm sure he'll be filled with admiration at the speech just delivered by his daughter. I also know the Honourable Lady sadly lost her mother earlier this year, and I have no doubt that she too will be simply bursting with pride as she looks down on us today. Because while the Honourable Lady may only have been an MP for a few short years, she has already established herself as a fantastic campaigner, including, actually, she said herself, changing the law to ban cyber flashing, saving Brecon Barracks, and with the Queen's Dragoon Guards, securing the return of a permanent Welsh regiment in Wales. Yeah. Nor was she prepared to remain silent while the Leader of the Opposition's colleagues in Cardiff tried to keep Wales in perpetual lockdown. Yeah. She is a tireless advocate for Welsh veterans and the armed services generally, an issue that is personal as well as political for her. And as a fellow enthusiast for dogs at polling stations, I was delighted to see her take Nancy the Labrador to the polling stations on Thursday. Nancy is, of course, named in honour of Nancy Astor, a great Conservative woman who certainly left a mark on this place and this country, and whose influence and achievements I am quite sure the Honourable Lady will emulate in the long and successful career that clearly awaits her. It was a pleasure to hear from her, and I thank her for seconding the motion. Mr. Speaker, on Sunday I spoke to my G7 counterparts together with President Zelensky, urging our international partners to join us in going further and faster in supporting Ukraine. And I'm sure the whole House will share my sorrow and revulsion at events in Mariupol in eastern Ukraine, which has endured weeks of merciless Russian bombardment and some of the worst atrocities of the war. At the same time, I'm pleased to report that our brave Ukrainian friends are second city with the same fortitude that saw off Putin's attack on their capital. We should be proud that when their very survival, the survival of great European democracy, was imperilled, our United Kingdom has led the way, providing Ukraine with the weapons to defend itself and helping the world to impose the toughest economic sanctions on Putin. As I walked through the streets of Kiev last month, I saw firsthand the wholehearted support, what the wholehearted support of this House and this country has meant to the brave people of Ukraine. So let the message ring out from this chamber today. We will persevere in our support for the Ukrainians until Putin has failed and Ukraine has won. Mr. Speaker, during the pandemic, this government worked night and day at extraordinary speed to protect lives and livelihoods across our whole United Kingdom, whether by injecting £400 billion of direct support for the economy and supporting jobs through our world-leading furlough scheme, becoming the first country in the world to administer an approved COVID vaccine, or by delivering the largest testing programme and the fastest vaccine booster campaign in Europe, all of which allowed us to retain one of the most open economies and societies across the continent, which we wouldn't have done, by the way, if you listened to the Vice Party office, with the fastest growth in the G7 last year. Now we will bring that same urgency, impatience and determination to deliver on our mission of getting our country back on track and easing the burdens on families and businesses across the land. That's why we've already committed £9.1 billion to assist with energy costs alone. We're giving back £150 to people in their council tax, cutting fuel duty, increasing the warm homes discount, creating increasing the warm homes discount, creating a tax cut for 30 million workers by raising the national insurance threshold, delivering the biggest ever increase in the national living wage, worth an extra £1,000 a year for those working full-time, Mr. Speaker. But however great our compassion and ingenuity, we cannot simply spend our way out of this problem. We need to grow out of this problem by creating hundreds of thousands of new high-wage, high-skill jobs across the country. And as I give way to the lady opposite, Mr. Speaker, I remind the House that there has never been a Labour government that left office with unemployment lower than when they came in.
Can I just say it's not normal we do give way, but obviously the Prime Minister has. Sir Owen.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Prime Minister for giving way. We've heard a lot of words very rapidly delivered, but what we haven't heard yet is an apology to the pensioners that are choosing between heating and eating, an apology to the children that have gone hungry throughout school holidays, and an apology to the hundreds of thousands of family members of COVID victims that were lost during the pandemic.
Mr. Speaker, of course, this government is doing absolutely all we can to help people during the pandemic, to help pensioners. And by the way, it was this government that introduced the triple lock for pensioners to protect them. This government that helps people with the cost of heating, the £9.1 billion that we're putting in, the holiday activities and food programme that we put in, Mr. Speaker, the extra billions that we're putting in to support local councils. But be in no doubt, this is what I think everybody in this country needs to understand. And what we are doing, Mr. Speaker, is making sure that we have a strong economy with high-wage, high-skilled jobs that will enable us to take this country forward. And that would simply not have been possible if she had listened to the advice of her front bench who wanted to keep us in lockdown, Mr. Speaker. And that's absolutely true. Absolutely true. And it was worth giving way just to make that point, Mr. Speaker. And that's why we're going to continue with our levelling up and our regeneration bill, which will help to... No. Sit down. Which will help create these jobs wherever people live in communities across the whole of the United Kingdom. That is the objective of this Queen's speech, Mr. Speaker. It is all focused on driving growth and jobs. Our schools and higher education bills will ensure that people have the skills to do them, raising standards in our classrooms, implementing the lifetime skills guarantee so people can retrain and acquire new qualifications at any stage of their life, and our energy bill will power our new green industrial revolution, creating hundreds of thousands of new green jobs, taking forward this government's energy security strategy. And about time this country had one, with £22 billion, Mr. Speaker, they didn't want a single nuclear power station. Come on, be honest. Look at them. Great quivering jellies of indecision that they are, Mr. Speaker. Our £22 billion infrastructure bank supporting the transition to net zero, vast new green industries in which our United Kingdom will once again lead the world. Mr. Speaker, just as we got Brexit done, so with this Queen's speech we will finish the job of unleashing the benefits of Brexit, to grow our economy, to cut the cost of living, and by bringing the urgency and ambition to how we exercise our freedoms that we have regained, our Brexit Freedoms Bill will enable us to amend or replace any inherited EU law with legislation in UK law that puts the interests of British business first and British families first. And so that is what we are going to do. We're going to seize the chance to make our United Kingdom the best regulated economy in the world. We're going to take forward those trade deals we've got with 70 different countries, worth over £800 billion a year, with specific legislation in this Queen's speech. I hope I'm not speaking too fast for the Honourable Opposite. For our new free trade agreements with Australia and New Zealand, and we're using our new freedoms to control our borders. With a new plan for immigration so we can fix our broken asylum system, tackle illegal immigration that undermines the legal immigration that we support. Crack down on the vile people smugglers. And I know that the Leader of the Opposition, or perhaps I should, in deference to his phrase, I should refer to him as the Leader of the Opposition of the moment, Mr. Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition of the moment. The Leader of the Opposition of the moment likes to oppose these plans, or he claims he opposes them, but it turns out that legislation to permit the offshoring of asylum seekers.
Order. Only one on the sorry, Prime Minister. Only one person can be on the feet at the same time. The Prime Minister is not giving way. Prime Minister.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition of the moment purports to oppose these plans, claims to oppose these plans, but it turns out they were actually pioneered in 2004 by a Labour government. The Right Honourable Gentleman may have got Tony Blair to take part in his election campaign, but it's a shame he cannot get behind Tony Blair's policies, Mr. Speaker. During the pandemic, we marvelled at the courage and commitment of so many people, all the people working in our public services, from the extraordinary men and women in our NHS, risking their lives to save others, to those toiling to keep our country going, whether in schools or shops or on public transport. So it is right, Mr. Speaker, that this government is now investing more in our NHS than any other government in history, giving our NHS the funding it needs to help clear the COVID backlogs, and we will also make sure that every penny is well spent. So whether through pop-up clinics in our communities, more face-to-face GP appointments, or new cancer screening machines, we maximise the ability of our NHS to check and treat its patients. But, Mr. Speaker, when times are tough and families are facing such pressures, we must also cut the cost of government and cut the burdens that government places on taxpayers and on citizens. We can't have expensive delays in delivering passports and driving licences that see families stranded and unable to go on holiday, HGV drivers unable to transport goods around this country in the way that is so integral. So integral to the economy we need, and we're going to fix it. So let me send a very clear message from this House today. This government will not tackle the post-COVID manana culture. We will take whatever steps are necessary to deliver for the British people, because the British people are not prepared to wait, and we share their impatience. Mr. Speaker, we will get through the aftershocks of COVID just as we got through COVID, as I've told you, with every ounce of ingenuity and compassion and hard work. Not by irresponsible spending that merely treats the symptoms of rising crises while creating an ever bigger problem for tomorrow, but by urgently pressing on with our mission to create the high-wage, high-skilled jobs that will drive economic growth across the United Kingdom, the whole United Kingdom. That is the long-term sustainable solution to ease the burden on families and businesses. That is the way to get our country back on track after the pandemic, to unite and level up across our whole country exactly as we promised. That is what this Queen's speech delivers, and I commend it to the House.
I now call the Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the Duke of Rossi for coming to Parliament today and leading us in the state opening. And
Chamber clear quietly. Ian Blackford.
thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the Duke of Rossi for coming to Parliament today, for leading us in the state opening with the address that we had, and to send the best wishes from everyone across the House, and certainly from our own benches, to the Queen on what is such a momentous year for her. We also need to reflect on those that we have sadly lost over the course of the last session of Parliament. And we think of James Brokenshire, we think of David Amos, and of course we think of Jack Dromey. Three outstanding but different parliamentarians, all who I think were a fine example to all of us of how to conduct ourselves in this place. Let me thank the member for Beverley and Holderness for his moving of the motion this afternoon, an erudite treatise round his history in government, and I hope he's still got a lot to give. He's made it very clear that he was removed early from office by the Prime Minister, and perhaps he still has some days ahead of him. But I think it's important that he stressed that the unity that there is in this House on the topic of Ukraine, that we all stand together, Mr Speaker, with our friends in Ukraine, and standing up for the warmonger, the war criminal that still resides in Moscow. He will face justice, and we will make sure that ultimately that the people of Ukraine prevail. But of course, I thought it was interesting that the honourable member told us that the recent difficulties that the Prime Minister has had with the Metropolitan Police, they are not new. He's had his collar felt in the past as well. And let me also thank the seconder of the motion from Brecon and Radnanshire. I think really what we had was a job application for government from the member, and I'm sure she'll have a long and fruitful career in front of her as a member of this House and a member of the governing party. Mr Speaker, as much as I hate to rub salt into wounds, this Queen's speech has one very obvious backdrop that deserves mention, and that's the democratic drubbing the Prime Minister and his party got last Thursday. And I know that they might want to hide from that reality, but the message from people right across these islands was crystal clear. The people made clear that this is now a Prime Minister facing his final days in office, and a Tory government that it's on its last legs. And I'm proud to say, Mr Speaker, that Scotland sent the strongest message of all. Now, I understand this might be a wee bit uncomfortable listening for the opposite benches, but they need to hear it all the same, because they need to hear what Scottish democracy is telling them, and has been telling them for years. Last Thursday, Mr Speaker, saw the best ever result for pro-independence parties in the local elections. The Scottish National Party is the largest party in the largest number of councils, the greatest ever result in a local election in our party's interest. This is, Mr Speaker, the 11th election victory in a row for the SNP, and it's the 8th election in a row that the SNP has won under the leadership of Nicola Sturgeon. Mr Speaker, a party in government winning more votes than winning more seats. Can you imagine that, Prime Minister? No, I can't. So, that's what we did. What about the Conservatives? Down by 100,000 votes, and they lost 66 seats in Scotland. And the worst news for all of them is, after all of that, they've still kept their leader. So, democracy has spoken in Scotland. It's spoken before, and it will speak again and again. And all our democratic decisions are saying exactly the same thing. Scotland rejects this Westminster government We reject the Tory party, and we are demanding the choice of an independent future. Yeah. Because the Scottish people know the cost of living with Westminster. We know the price we pay with a Prime Minister and the price of being stuck with a Tory government we didn't vote for. And it's a price none of us in Scotland, not one of us, can afford to pay any longer. And at that I will give way.
I thank the right honourable gentleman for giving way. And I'd like to ask him a direct question. How does it feel that 8 years after Scotland so conclusively said no to separation, that the pro-independence parties are still getting the same proportion of votes as they achieved 8 years ago, despite everything that's been thrown at us and despite, frankly, everything that we've thrown at ourselves? When will the right honourable gentleman admit that the game is up?
Well, I have to say, and I'm going to call him my honourable friend because I do enjoy his company, but I have to say to him that if the game is up, if the game is up for anybody or any party, then the game is up for the Tory party in Scotland, and the game is up for the Union. And I say to him that he needs to reflect on the fact that the SNP's won the last 11 elections, as I said. We went to the public and we asked for a mandate to have an independence referendum. Well, I hear from a sedentary position we didn't get one. I would ask honourable members opposite to reflect very carefully. Because when we consider the first-past-the-post elections, firstly, to the Scottish Parliament last year, we won 62 of the 73 seats. And there is, Mr Speaker, a pro-independence majority in the Scottish Parliament. And we hear in the Queen's speech today about respecting democracy. Why are the Scottish Conservatives and those in London denying democracy for the people of Scotland? Correct. How many times, Mr Speaker, how many times do the people of Scotland have to elect the SNP into government and Westminster says no? What price democracy? What price democracy, Mr Speaker, when this place ignores the sovereign right and the will of the Scottish people? And I will tell you this, that a day of reckoning will come for those that are seeking to frustrate the rights of Scots to have a referendum, because, Mr Speaker, that day will come. And that day will come, and not only will there be a referendum, but we will win that referendum, because, Mr Speaker, that is what democracy is about.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Does he agree with me that the reason that this shower of corrupt criminal Conservatives are blocking Scotland's right, Scotland's democratic and legal right to have a democratic mandate over their own future, is because they know.
David Davis.
Mr Speaker, it is in breach of this House's regulations
that
somebody calls somebody else a criminal in this job.
Corrupt. It wasn't a particular member, as you know. What I will... Just a minute. I don't think I need any help. What I would say is we want moderate and tolerant language that doesn't bring this House or expect members outside to copy the behaviour. I want good behaviour and I want moderate language. I want people to think before they speak. Ian Blackford, no.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I agree with my honourable friend, and I'll come on to...
We don't want to get into this.
I will come on to these points in just a second, but let me say respectfully to in particular to the member for West Aberdeenshire and from the member from Banff and Buchan, because I think they know that a referendum will come. And let me take the warnings from the Speaker about behaviour in this House and how we should all reflect on our behaviour and how we all interact with each other. And that goes right across the House, and I say that to my friend from Edinburgh South sitting on the Labour front bench as well. That when we have that referendum, it's implicit on all of us that we engage constructively. And let's examine, and by all means pull apart, the arguments for and against Scottish independence. But let's treat the electorate with respect. And let's trust the electorate who have given the Scottish Government that mandate to have that referendum. Mr Speaker, the most... You know, I hear what you did in 2014. You know, point is that the electorate are given a choice in election to elect a government, and a government that has a mandate for an independence referendum. And let's not forget that in 2014, we were explicitly told that if we stayed in the United Kingdom, that our rights as European citizens would be respected. And what did this House do to Scotland? This House took Scotland out of the European Union against its will. And it's perfectly right, under those circumstances, Mr Speaker, that the people of Scotland have got the right to revisit whether or not they wish to become independent. I'm going to make some progress. The most glaring omission in this Queen's speech is the complete lack of any immediate action to help people with the biggest inflationary crisis in 50 years. Democracy spoke last Thursday, but it's pretty evident that the government hasn't listened. And what we saw from the Prime Minister today, he certainly hasn't learned. Because, of course, people turned out last week to punish the Prime Minister for the scandal of Partygate. Let's not forget, the public know that this Prime Minister is the first, the only Prime Minister that has found to have broken his own laws in office and still sits here as Prime Minister. That should shame this House as it shames us. But the electorate also turned out to punish a Prime Minister and a Chancellor who have been so consumed by the crisis of Partygate that they've failed to lift a finger to fight the Tory-made cost of living crisis. Mr Speaker, as the Bank of England confirmed last week, the occupants of number 10 and number 11 Downing Street have now led us to the brink of recession. As my friend, the member for Glasgow Central, has said, the very first line of the Queen's speech should have been a commitment to bring forward an emergency budget. Where is it? Where is it? Where's the emergency budget that we need? An emergency budget to tackle now the rising cost of energy, of fuel and of food.
On that point, would you
I'll give way.
Thank you. I'm grateful to him for giving way. Would he agree with me that it is remarkable that for a government that says it cares about the cost of living crisis, there was absolutely nothing new in this Queen's speech, for example, around a mass home installation programme, which would be the cheapest, most effective, fastest way of getting our emissions down, creating hundreds of thousands of jobs, tackling climate emissions as well, yet we've had nothing new in this Queen's speech on that at all.
My honourable friend is right. There's nothing in this Queen's speech to deal with the cost of living crisis, nothing to deal with home insulation. And, you know, in the Scottish Parliament, the cooperation, the collaboration between the SNP and the Greens is an example where two parties can come together to make sure that we prioritise the climate emergency, something really missing from this Queen's speech today. Mr Speaker, Scottish Power have already called for urgent action. They have called for £1,000 bill discounts for 10 million families before energy bills rocket by another £900 this autumn. And yet, once again, nothing from the Prime Minister and the Chancellor in this Queen's speech. In fact, the Chancellor has already told us that this strategy to tackle the cost of living crisis is literally to sit in his hands because he thinks it would be silly to act. Silly to act at a time that people are facing tough decisions and whether to turn the heating off, whether they can afford to put food on the table. And the Chancellor thinks it's silly to act. That tells everything that we need to know about the humanity and the compassion of this Conservative government. And yet, just like the Spring Statement, nothing has come from this government. This Queen's speech represents one more missed opportunity. And I can give the Prime Minister some suggestions. He could have matched the Scottish child payment, which doubled in April and will increase to £25 per week per child by the end of this year. Positive action to help those most in need. It could have matched the increase in Scottish issued social security payments by 6%. It could have done what governments are supposed to do in emergency, help people through it. By any measure or meaning, this government fails on all counts. Mr Speaker, another gaping hole in this programme is when it comes to energy policy, as has already been raised. As my friend, the member for Kilmarnock and Loudon, has rightly said last month, the Prime Minister's energy strategy is nothing more than a contract, lacking any substance or ambition. The lack of ambition to drive growth and green investment and forge the path to net zero, not to mention an industrial strategy to back it up, fails this and future generations. That lack of ambition won't help investment in renewables, and it won't help a just transition, and it certainly won't help consumers now or in the long term. And as for us in Scotland, a country so rich in energy potential, it is fleecing us of our green present and future.
On that point.
Yeah.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the right honourable member for giving way. His constituency and my constituency border the Comity Firth, which has the Nig fabrication yard where many of the mightiest platforms, oil production platforms in the North Sea were constructed. Would it not be a positive suggestion to Her Majesty's Government that we should power ahead with building floating offshore wind structures in the Highlands of Scotland, and that would help the Prime Minister and it would help us in Scotland as well?
I'm very grateful for that intervention, and I agree 100% with what he said. In fact, he and I have been talking about that over the course of the recent months. There is fantastic potential for the Highlands, and not just for the Highlands, but for the whole of Scotland, to benefit from the industrial revolution that will come from the opportunities in green energy. And, Mr. Speaker, we need to make sure that we learn from the lessons of the past, that we are able to capture that supply chain. And if we go back to the 1970s, Nig was a thriving industrial base, thousands of jobs in that community supporting the oil industry. And I know that my honourable friend, like I, wants to see the Highlands and Islands being a thriving area where there's an industrial future for us. But yes, absolutely, we need the UK Government to help us on that. And I look forward to, together with my honourable friend, having discussions with the Government and exactly how we take that forward. I can see the Secretary of State for Scotland, so perhaps we can discuss that over the coming days. Since the start of this year alone, we know that the UK Government has profited by at least £1.7 billion from the revenues that have been brought in from North Sea oil. All that revenue from Scotland's resources, and still this UK Government is refusing to match the Scottish Government's £500 million Just Transition Fund to help ease resilience on fossil fuels. And still, Mr. Speaker, no commitment to carbon capture and storage in Scotland's North East. Not only is this with the Westminster Government harming our planet, they are holding Scotland back.
I am genuinely grateful for the right honourable gentleman for giving way, particularly on the Scottish cluster being so important to my constituency in Banff and Buchan. Would he agree that the UK Government has thus far committed £41 million to that project, but that wasn't what I wanted to intervene on. What I wanted to intervene on was his mention of the £500 million Just Transition Fund for the North East of Scotland. Could he do what his colleagues from Kilmarnock, Loudon and Aberdeen South haven't been able to do thus far, and describe in detail what is that £500 million going to be spent on in the North East of Scotland?
It's not being spent.
Well, let me just say to the honourable gentleman that we've been shortchanged on not getting carbon capture and storage in Scotland. Twice now we've been promised it was coming. And we all know in Scotland that getting carbon capture and storage in the North East of Scotland with the Acorn project is absolutely instrumental in getting to net zero by 2045. It's absolutely instrumental in making sure that Grangemouth has a green chemical future. And there can be no more dithering, there can be no more delay. And the Acorn project must be greenlit, and it must be greenlit now. Now, I'll say to the honourable member that yes, we will spell out exactly the plan for that £500 million transition fund. And I'll say to him, I'll say to the House now, that we will take our responsibilities on these benches, and together with my friend from Kilmarnock and Loudon and my friend from Aberdeen South, we will be speaking more on our future energy potential for Scotland, because we will accept our responsibilities to deliver that energy strategy, to deliver that industrial policy which is lacking from those on the government front bench. And of course,
bargain for more funding.
Mr. Speaker, I've concentrated on what the legislation in this Queen Speech fails to do in terms of tackling the cost of living crisis and our green future. But what the legislation in this Queen Speech does propose to enact is every bit as harmful. Because at the heart of the session's programmes, there's a twin track that needs to be challenged: an attack on devolution, an attack on human rights law. As the Prime Minister gets increasingly vulnerable and desperate, it is probably no surprise that he's reached back for the policy that got him the job in the first place: Brexit. The Brexit Freedoms Bill to repeal EU retained law and the other Brexit legislation in his Queen's Speech represent a race to the bottom on standards. The very idea that Westminster will be able to strike down devolved legislators' retained EU laws is the latest and only the latest in a long line of Tory power. I mean, the Prime Minister shakes his head, but that's the reality. We've seen it over the course of the last few years. The Scottish Parliament have the right to retain EU law because we have the opportunity and the right to find our way back into the European Union. And we won't be denied the right to retain EU law, and we won't be denied the right to an independent future in Europe. And the same applies to our human rights laws. The proposal by this UK government to rip up the Human Rights Act is one more example of a government that is prepared to force through legislation that is not only immoral but internationally illegal. The attack on human rights legislation is all the more concerning given the context of the continuing failure to respond compassionately and comprehensively to the ongoing Ukrainian refugee crisis, not to mention the anti-refugee bill that was passed in the previous session. The agenda of this Westminster government couldn't be clearer. A hostile environment to devolution, to human rights law and to refugees. And that agenda continues apace in the Queen's speech.
On that point, will he give way?
I'll happily give way.
I'm grateful to him for giving way. Both the government's independent review of the Human Rights Act and the cross-party Joint Committee of Human Rights have found that there's no case, no evidence base for replacing the Human Rights Act with a British Bill of Rights. So does he agree with me that the only reason the government are trying to do this is because as long as the Human Rights Act is on the statute book, it's a serious threat to their project of diminishing the accountability of the executive?
Absolutely. My honourable and learned friend is absolutely correct, and the public should be very afraid as to what this government is doing and the consequences of that, and to our hard-fought and hard-won human rights that have been built up over many decades. Mr. Speaker, I will.
I think the right honourable gentleman would probably accept that I give a lot of credence to the human rights of British citizens. But the primary argument I've seen with respect to the modification of the Human Rights Act is giving the government the ability to deport criminals, foreign criminals, who are being released from prison. This is an important right of a government, and surely that's worth having and nothing else.
Well, I'm afraid that is a fig leaf, Mr. Speaker, for exactly what is going on, which is the attack on the rights that have been so hard fought and won over the course of the last few decades. All of this is the cost of living with Westminster, and it's exactly, Mr. Speaker, why Scotland wants out. So just as this, I'm going to have to make progress. So just as this Queen's speech seeks to, I hear Scotland doesn't want out. It doesn't want out.
I've not been watching.
Yeah, and I hope he rises to his feet at some point in the Queen's speech debate and tries to defend it. Because what I'll say to the honourable gentleman, and I'll say to the Prime Minister, is we've got the mandate for an independence referendum. If he doesn't think that we're going to win it, let's bring it on and have the referendum. And I'll tell you what, he'll soon find that Scotland will vote for independence. So just as this Queen's speech seeks to entrench Brexit Britain, our Scottish Parliament will bring forward legislation to offer a very different future to our people. A positive and progressive future at the heart of Europe. And we're not seeking the Prime Minister's permission. The only permission that we need. We can see the Prime Minister just couldn't care less because he's sitting talking to his friends on the government front bench. That's the disdain. That's the disdain that we see for the people in Scotland from this government. They simply couldn't care less. So we're not seeking the Prime Minister's permission. The only permission we need, the only permission we will ever need, is the democratic permission of the Scottish people. And let's not forget that it's the people of Scotland who hold sovereignty. And you might want to listen to this, because let's not forget the legal opinion in the case of McCormick versus the Crown at the Court of Session in 1953, when Lord Cooper stated that the principle of the unlimited sovereignty of Parliament is a distinctly English principle that has no counterpart in Scottish constitution. It is, Mr. Speaker, unquestionably the right of those in Scotland to determine their own future. Those rights were enshrined in the claim of right that was so instrumental in delivering our devolved Parliament, and is the case today as we seek to exercise our rights in an independence referendum. Let me remind the words to the Prime Minister of Parnell, who used to sit on these very benches. No man has the right to fix the boundary of the march of a nation. No man has the right to say to his country, "Thus far shalt go and no further." Mr. Speaker, time and time again, the people of Scotland have spoken, and they want a choice. The choice to choose our own future. They spoke in the last Holyrood election, and they spoke again last Thursday. And the longer that Scottish democracy speaks, the louder it will get. If the Conservatives want to stand in the way, if they want to try and deny democracy, then they should well be warned. Democracy will sweep them away, just as their party was swept away last week.
I now come to the Father of the House, Sir Peter Bottomley.
Can I say to the parliamentary leader of the SNP, it's a delight to follow him. Sometimes it's more of a delight to precede him. Today, I might just remind him that the electorate don't always vote in the same numbers the same way. Between 2010 and 2015, the SNP vote went up. The SNP vote went up after they lost the referendum. By 2017, their vote had gone down by about 26%. I think it's worthwhile looking through his notes, some of which he gave us this afternoon, to check how the figures change, and they may change again. I won't at the moment. I'm only talking about his speech at the moment. I haven't started talking about mine, if that's all right. I think that nothing I can say need detain the Leader of the House. The Prime Minister or the Leader of the Opposition, they want to go off, because I know they've had hard days. But what I want to say is that I'm concerned about people's home lives. 2 small changes to park home owners will make a great deal of difference. In 2010, the then Housing Minister said there would be park home reform. We haven't had it. We need to change from RPI to CPI pitch fees. That could be incorporated in the next finance bill, and I hope that that will happen. The second is the question of commissions. Why should those who are park home residents have to lose a significant part of the value of their home when they sell it? Those 2 things can be changed quite simply. The second, probably by a handout bill. There are plenty of MPs who may come up in the ballot. I haven't come up in the ballot in 4 or 6 years, who would take that forward. But the RPI-CPI one is one which government can do quite easily. In the notes to the Queen's speech, and I can thank the government for giving us copious notes on the proposals in the Queen's speech, we learned that the number of social tenants is about 4 million, and the number of leasehold tenants, private tenants, about 4 million, private ones, social, and leaseholders, about 4.6 million. And the fastest growing proportion of home occupation are leaseholders. We won't get decent information from the last census, because the only choices people could put down was they owned their home or they were a tenant. And when I asked people what a leaseholder should say, I wasn't given a clear answer. People think they own them. They might have said, I own them. They're wrong. If they put down a tenant, they might have thought, I'm not actually, I'm a leaseholder. Why the people who compiled that census question couldn't actually wake up to the fact there are 4.6 million households, actually there are probably about 6 million to be complete, but let's take the 4.6 million. Why do we have our Office of National Statistics and our Department of What's now levelling up, allowing a question which doesn't allow accurate answers and totals to be given? Then on leasehold, the Department of Housing, levelling up, over the years has commissioned the Law Commission to make reports on what would make life easier, fairer and cheaper. We haven't had that legislation put forward. There are words about how something will happen in this Parliament. We know that uncontroversial legislation often comes into the last expected year of a Parliament and often can be lost if the election comes early. Let's assume the election is likely to come in May 2024. Will those 4.6 million leaseholders still be left hanging on the chance of the legislation not getting through both Houses of Parliament when it's been proposed? I asked the government to try to make sure that they get that legislation ready for the next session and get it through early as a priority. I suspect they could start in the House of Lords and get it through to the House of Commons fast, rather than having the controversial stuff starting here. I've spent about 15 years following others who are doing it for longer in trying to get justice for leaseholders. The number of crooks in the field, the number of exploiters, the number of heartless people, the sort of people who one could use parliamentary privilege on quite justifiably, need to be held back, and the ordinary people need to be brought forward. We heard in the debates on the Building Safety Bill how many people were stuck and how government eventually came round to making changes which are very welcome. On the fire safety defects, we know we have to find the problems, fix the problems, fund the problems, and then get the money back from those who haven't yet coughed up. I want to turn lastly, if I may, just to planning. Someone has started a petition, parliamentary petition number 611113, about banning development on farmland. That petition has been signed already in the last week by over 700 of my own constituents, let alone the many others. The person who wrote to me, who's not actually one of my constituents, said a migrating bird coming to the south coast might start thinking, I've got to the coast, I can rest. If you have a solid wall of housing between the south coast and the South Downs, they've got to go on miles more. That shouldn't be happening. And I put this particular plea through the Prime Minister to the Secretary of State for Levelling Up on the planning appeal, the appeal against the planning decision for a judicial review granted by the High Court in the last few days, where the Department for Levelling Up had one inspector who was about to approve the protection of the Goring Gap, Chatsmore Farm, between Goring and Ferring, one in Worthing, one in Arran District Council. That inspector was about to approve the protection of this area when a second inspector, much to everyone's surprise, allowed the building of over 400 homes on one of the very few agricultural fields between the South Downs and the coast on the west side of Worthing. That decision is now to be heard in the High Court. I asked the government to decide they will not oppose the application for judicial review, not oppose the overturning of the decision, cancel the decision, or at least let the court cancel it, and say they will never again allow two inspectors to toss a coin for development of major farmland in one of the very few areas in a built-up area. I would say that if we want local democracy, we need to trust local councils, but even if we can't trust local councils, and I frankly do, we can't trust a department, inspectorate, which allows two inspectors to make decisions which are incompatible with each other's responsibilities. I know that the political success of the Labour Party in Worthing will lead to a new leader of the council, but I'm delighted that the present leader of the Labour group on the council came to the Goring Gap at my invitation to make a speech in favour of asking government to solve this problem. I hope the leader of the opposition, who's visited on a couple of times, once telling people and the other time not telling people he was coming, and don't mind not telling me, he didn't even tell the Labour Party he was coming. He wanted the photograph. But things have changed since then. Let's hope that government can see sense and protect the Goring Gap, the Chatsmore Farm and local democracy.
Dave McHillier.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And Mr Speaker, we've got finally the Queen's speech, 30 bills and what the Prime Minister calls fiscal firepower. Well, I can't see that fiscal firepower in what's being done to support our constituents, and I fear that many of these 30 bills are like so many of recent government policies, mere headlines or worse, dog whistle headlines that appeal to a certain section of our electorate but do nothing to solve the real problems that our constituents face. I should declare at the outset, Mr Speaker, that I am a leaseholder in a property that is having cladding removed, and I concur completely with the honourable member for West Worthing about the challenges for that group of people and for leaseholders more generally. And it is disappointing that we still have so much work to be done on leasehold reform. But in Hackney South and Shoreditch, as in many constituencies up and down the country, we need real support for the people who've been left behind. In my constituency, we see a huge challenge with 1 in 2 children living in poverty after housing costs are taken into account. And in London, we know that 60% of households in poverty are working households. That's an increase from 44% only a few years ago. And it's a reflection of the low pay that too many workers are paid and the high housing costs in constituencies like mine. So We all know that employment is a huge opportunity, but it is not a route out of poverty on its own for many people in London because of these high living costs. And that cost of living crisis is not just hitting those in constituencies like mine with those high prices, but biting everybody, biting now those who are just about managing, those who are on good incomes, but hitting huge increases to their fuel bills. And we know the government's response to that has been, from the Klarna Chancellor, lend the money now and people have to pay it back later, further indebting particularly the poorest households. So we need much better support for those left behind. And the government talks about levelling up. But in Hackney, we don't see much of this levelling up fund. We are the 7th most deprived local authority area in the country. But in the government's approach to levelling up, Hackney counts as priority 2. And yet, constituencies like Richmondshire, Derbyshire Dales and High Peak, which are respectively the 256th, the 265th and the 202nd most deprived constituencies in the country, are being prioritised over those children in my constituency living in poverty, living in overcrowded conditions, too often, sharing a bed with a parent up to the age of early teens because there is nowhere else for them to sleep, and struggling because of the challenges of the pandemic. They need support, and we must make sure, and this government needs to hear, that levelling up isn't just about levelling up in between different regions of the UK, but in parts of London within our amazing capital city. And of all people, the Prime Minister, who had the honour of serving as the elected Mayor of London, should be aware of that, and it is a shame on him that he is not tackling this head-on. We need much better support, Mr. Speaker, for housing generally. I have more private renters in my constituency than I have homeowners, and more social housing tenants than both of those combined, and all have real problems. And the government is finally unveiling its renters reform bill, something that we're all keen to see, but just abolishing no-fault evictions isn't enough to solve the challenges of where people can live. You cannot live now in the private sector and grow a family, because even with no-fault evictions being abolished, if that does eventually happen, it doesn't make it a stable home, with rents escalating at the whim of the landlord. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
Very grateful, Mr. Speaker. Doesn't she understand, though, this gracious speech is all about levelling up and giving people more opportunity, and there needs to be a surge of private investment into these places with better paid jobs and better skills training and better education. That is the whole point of it, and will she support that?
Well, Mr. Speaker, if that's the whole point of it, forgive me, but I can't see that. I have the privilege of chairing the Public Accounts Committee, where we have looked at the Towns Fund and the levelling up approach. And it is a chaotic policy. It is a headline without proper detail and analysis about how to deliver this. Only the Bristol area has seen economic growth outside London over many decades now. It is a challenge for every government, but the idea that headlines saying it's going to happen are actually going to deliver is just for the birds. And we see this huge increase in private renters, and yet no real support for them. Where is the security? If you cannot afford to buy your own home, and you cannot qualify for social rented housing, which in my constituency is in massively short supply in any case, with hundreds, thousands of families living in massively overcrowded conditions. We've all been on the doorsteps a lot in the last week, Mr. Speaker, and it's a privilege to always meet constituents. But when you keep meeting constituents who you knew when their children were toddlers, whose children are still living, sharing the bedroom, 2 or 3 of them, while their parents live in the living room, and those children are now young adults, it's not good enough. There is no hope for those people, because the government and these proposed bills do nothing to enable councils to build that important social rented housing, give better rights to renters, and provide a proper stepladder to purchasing your own home. Every policy so far has fuelled the equity in those who already own their home, rather than giving a real leg up to wannabe first-time buyers in constituencies like mine, where a 2-bedroom modern flat, as I've said repeatedly in this House, Mr. Speaker, but I repeat it again, on the market for around £750,000. That's just for a 2-bedroom leasehold flat. And as of June of last year, the median house price in the constituency was £600,000. but there aren't many. I'd be struggling to find a property for that price in many parts of my constituency. But that's a huge increase, 9.1% over the past 5 years. A house in Hackney costs more than 16 times the average Hackney salary. And that's not, and you know, Hackney has a range of salaries, though there are a lot of people at the poorer end. And 1 in 35 people in my constituency are recorded officially as homeless or in temporary accommodation. But that doesn't include those overcrowded ones, those who are overcrowded because there's no space for them to go, and those with no recourse to public funds who can't possibly afford to rent privately, even though they're working, and certainly can never buy. And rents, as we all know, are very, very high. So we need much better support, and there's no real solution in this Queen's speech. And crucially, we need real support for a lost generation. Many people have been very badly affected by COVID. But a group that I worry about particularly are our children, who have lost out on 2 years of education. And hats off to the teachers and schools that kept educating them. But for many children, however well the school did, if you didn't have the technology at home, you were clustered around one computer and a mobile phone with poor data, that was never going to be the same as a classroom experience. So schools did the best they could, and many did a very, very good job. But there is a challenge for children who lost out on education, who will go through the system without catching up under the government's proposal. So I look forward to seeing what's in their bill. But realistically, and I've been talking to my schools about the cost of their energy bills as just one recent crisis. And the cost increase on their energy bills mean the choice between heating the school or losing a teacher. So having our children freeze in a classroom but being taught by a teacher, or a warm school where they can concentrate on learning but losing that crucial classroom teacher. That's the stark reality, and I'm happy to share with anybody in the government the figures from the schools that have provided it to me if we can work together for a solution on that. But the cost of catch-up is a cost that is absolutely vital we pay. It is taxpayers' money well spent to invest in the generation that will be the engine of our future, that will be the entrepreneurs. Because my constituency may be poor, but it has no poverty of aspiration. But unless we give those children the leg up now and the catch up now, they will not get the advantages that they should have. And we've seen the complete failure of the tutoring scheme, which my cross-party committee highlighted as a concern very early on. We said, where are these tutors that are going to go in and tutor? And of course, that contract has been axed. So we still need a lot of support. We're seeing children in years 7 and 8, according to teachers in my constituency, having to be taught how to do decent handwriting because they missed those crucial years at primary school. Pupils in years 7 and 8 losing out in some areas because the qualified teachers are focused on the exam years. And we all want our children to succeed, and the government needs to make sure that school funding is properly resolved. It's fallen in average terms, in real terms, per pupil by 1.2% for the most deprived fifths of schools, but increased by nearly 3% for the least deprived fifths of schools. Is this levelling up? It doesn't look like it to me. And the Prime Minister purports to be an intelligent man. I'm sure he can do the maths and work out that that means there's an awful lot of children losing out. I was pleased to see that the Victims Bill is finally, perhaps going to appear. It's only been in 3 manifestos and 4 Queen's speeches. But this is a real crucial problem. Again, my committee has looked at the backlog in the criminal courts. There are many factors to that, some of which cannot be resolved through legislation. The sheer grind of day-to-day delivery and government of decent public services is something that seems alien to the Prime Minister and his front bench. But that aside, we need this Victims Bill to support victims better. Like the woman in my constituency, violently attacked by her partner in front of her 7-year-old daughter. She went to the police. The court case was set for 2 years after that violent attack. It is no surprise that he has repeatedly broken his non-molestation order because he feels that he can get away with it scot-free. And this is happening to victims up and down the country. And for those particularly in that kind of domestic abuse situation, she has said to me, I just want to move, I want a shot of this. I don't want to be reliving this, nor do I want my daughter to relive this over the next 2 years. And if the Victims' Bill is to mean anything in terms of domestic violence, it needs decent options on alternative housing for those who are victims, because that's so often the break that those people need, and they cannot get it. In my constituency, with such a shortage of housing, that is a huge and ongoing issue. I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
To the shortage of housing, and we need to get more houses delivered. So will she be supporting the reforms to the planning system that have been incorporated in today's Queen's speech?
Mr. Speaker, I will support anything that delivers the housing. I haven't had a chance to look at the detail. I think we do not yet know all of the detail. But absolutely, in my constituency, if there's a bit of land and nothing's moving on it, we are looking at it as an option for housing. But we cannot fit everything into an inner-city London borough. We need a better balance of housing, but we do definitely need that more affordable housing. And in a constituency like mine, we need more socially rented housing, because the other options are not real options for people. People who've been housed in temporary accommodation in other boroughs outside of my constituency often want to move back. When they're on a 5-year lease, I say to them that is, at the moment, the current situation, thanks to this government, often the best you'll get. But when the rent is as high as it is in the private sector, they worry because they cannot survive without some benefit top-up if it fits in with the housing benefit cap. And so they are stuck in a terrible cycle of never being able to have a permanent home. I just wanted to touch on a couple of other issues that have been raised in a lengthy Queen's speech. The Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, talks about Brexit being done. Well, Prime Minister, you know and I know that it's not done, is it? It's far from done. And there is going to be a very long tail of changes that have been repeatedly delayed. There was no planning after the vote in 2016. We've seen import controls once again delayed, and it's not even clear what will change. Businesses are confused, people are confused, and that lack of planning is coming home to roost. So you can use the Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, can use the slogans, but we can see through them, and he can have a peruse any day he wants of the committee reports that we've put out there highlighting these concerns. And the Queen's speech has got a whole chunk of dividing issues that the Prime Minister would love me to engage with now, but I'm not going to give him that satisfaction, because I want real results for the people in my constituency, not the flim-flam and the cheap headlines of things that he hopes will start culture wars between members of this House and our voters, because everybody in this House and all our constituents know that the cost of living has to be a priority, that levelling up has to be a priority. I was pleased to see a UK infrastructure bank announced, Mr. Speaker, but I'm a bit puzzled, because this is the same government that created the Green Investment Bank and then a few years later sold it off to the private sector. So if this infrastructure bank is going to invest in green technologies, well, good, if it works, but why have we had a decade of wasted time on that opportunity? In summary, Mr. Speaker, this bill is not about bringing our country together and supporting people who need it. It's about division. Our Prime Minister has his head in the sand about real life and the real challenges of the cost of living and finding a home for so many of our constituents. There is no direction from this government that's flailing around trying to come up with a list of headlines, but unable to competently govern this country in the interests of the people I represent.
Honourable Theresa May.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I refer members to my entry in the Members' Register. It is indeed a privilege to be able to speak in this debate on the humble address in Her Majesty's Platinum Jubilee year. And as others have already spoken, everybody across this House, including myself, wishes Her Majesty all the very best and thanks her for her unstinting service and her exemplary devotion to duty. As others have done, I would also like to recognise the passing of 3 excellent members of this House, Sir David Amis, James Brokenshire and Jack Dromey. They all came into this House in order to make a difference, to improve people's lives, and they worked unstintingly to do just that. And I would like to congratulate my honourable friends and members for Beverley and Holderness and Brecon and Radnorshire for their absolutely excellent speeches in proposing and seconding this gracious speech of the humble address. I want to speak about a few of the elements of the government's programme that I very much welcome. The Modern Slavery Bill, will cement the government's commitment to enhance the provisions on supply chains. I understand the first element will be an extension of the requirements on supply chains to public procurement, to government departments. This is important. In 2019, as Prime Minister, I committed the government to use its power of public procurement to actually ensure that it was cleaning up supply chains and cracking down on modern slavery. I genuinely believe that dealing with supply chains is one of the key ways in which we can ensure that we eradicate modern slavery. Business has a huge role to play here, so does government. Section 54 was important in the Modern Slavery Act, but of course it doesn't actually require action other than putting something in an account, in your report and accounts, which might be to say that you've done nothing about modern slavery. So it is excellent that the government is now moving this forward and going to enhance this legislation. I think it could be transformative. I also want to welcome the Social Housing Regulation Bill. One of the clear messages that came from residents and survivors of the terrible tragedy that was the fire at Grenfell Tower was the concern that for not just months but for years, the voice of residents in social housing had not been heard, had not been listened to by those in authority who had responsibility to respond. This was something that we then discovered from consultation across the country was not unique to Grenfell Tower, but sadly there were too many occasions where those responsible for social housing were simply not listening to the points that their tenants were raising. So it is important that we enhance the ability of tenants to have their voice raised, enhance the regulation regime, and ensure that we can do something which is so important in this country, which is to raise the value for people of social housing. So the stigma is not attached to social housing and being in social housing. We're all one community. The type of housing we live in should be irrelevant to how we are treated. And important here also is the Renters Reform Bill. I note the briefing says it will provide 4.4 million households with more secure and higher quality homes. Renting is the only option for more and more people, and for some it is the flexible option that they actively want. But it isn't easy if you then live feeling that you could be evicted through no fault of your own. And dealing with those no-fault evictions was a commitment that has been made previously. I seem to remember my government made it, and I sincerely hope that it will now be enacted through this bill. When it comes to housing, it is important for the government to recognise the many concerns that were expressed by the public and by members of this House, across the House, on the elements of the planning white paper that the government published. And I understand that the Housing Secretary has heard those messages and is looking carefully at what should be in the planning bill. We do need more homes. We need to ensure they're in the right place. We need to ensure they're in designs that are actually in keeping with the community and the neighbourhood in which they are set. I believe the Housing Secretary is interested in these street votes, so that if in a street somebody wants to extend their house by 2 floors, they can have a vote in the street and the street will decide whether that's a sensible thing to do. Can I simply say to my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister and others on the front bench, that I think the government needs to be very careful about the potential unintended consequences of such a move. I can well imagine a situation in which somebody persuades their neighbours in the street to agree to sorts of development that might enhance the value of their houses, but actually has a negative impact on the wider community and the wider neighbourhood. Looking at the issues of planning, and this ties in with the energy bill and issues in relation to the energy bill, I do wish the government, hope that the government, I urge them, to take the opportunity to move ahead in relation to building regulations, to ensure that we embrace now the standards that will be required for our reaching net zero. We are still seeing new homes being built with gas boilers, and those are going to be retrofitted in a few years' time. And so wouldn't it make more sense to actually make sure that the regulations ensure that we actually do take the moves now for net zero? But I welcome the energy bill, and there is much in there that will help us to move to net zero, and that is excellent. I also welcome the National Security Bill, which I expect will enhance our ability to deal with threats from hostile states. That is very important, it's increasingly necessary, and it is very timely. In relation to Northern Ireland, there is reference in the Queen's speech to the Legacy Bill. I think it is important, I've said it before in this House, that we reach a point where there is an ability to try to draw a line on the past, but that must be done sensitively in recognition of the sensitivities of all communities. I note there is no... I will give way to...
Mr. Speaker, thank you. I think there's an explanation there. I was at the Nigerian embassy getting my pass so that I can go to Nigeria at the end of May. Can I ask the Honourable Lady, it's really important for my constituents, those who have lost loved ones. I can name in the Ballydugan 4, Stuart Montgomery, murdered by the IRA, nobody ever made accountable. My cousin, nobody ever made accountable. I want justice. My relatives want justice. My constituents want justice. Does the Honourable Lady agree?
Can I say
Theresa May.
I say to the honourable gentleman, we welcome him back to his place in the chamber. That is why I say it is important that these issues are addressed sensitively. They have consistently been looked at by some of my colleagues in relation to those veterans who may find themselves being caught before justice. But what is important is that people who did lose loved ones during the Troubles, and the majority of those losses will have been at the hands of terrorists, but who did lose loved ones during the Troubles, are able to feel that sense of, first of all, actually understanding what has happened and being able to know what has happened. And I think this is one of the things that is driving the government's intention in relation to this bill. And they will want to be able to feel some sense of closure, which they have not been able to see for so many years. I note that there is no reference to what has been referred to in the papers as a bill in relation to, and I'm going to use the word, the Northern Ireland Protocol, and possibly to varying the terms of the treaty unilaterally. Can I say to my right honourable friend, and he will not be surprised if I say this, that I do not feel that that would be the right move for the government, that I think the government needs to consider not just some immediate issues, but also the wider sense of what such a move would say about the United Kingdom and its willingness to abide by treaties which it has signed. I will give way to the right honourable.
I thank the former Prime Minister for giving way. Can I say to her, with great respect that I hold her in, that surely what is more important here is the Good Friday Belfast Agreement and the need to protect the political institutions. I stood in the election last week. Not a single unionist member was returned to the Assembly that supports the protocol. There is no consensus for this. It needs to be dealt with. It is harming our economy. It is driving up the cost of living. It is undermining political stability in Northern Ireland. It threatens the Good Friday Agreement. It has to be dealt with.
Say to the right honourable gentleman that I put a deal before this House which actually met the requirements of the Good Friday Agreement and actually enabled us not to have a border down the Irish Sea or to have a border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Sadly, the DUP and others across this House chose to reject that, but it was just such an opportunity for what he wanted. Can I say to my right honourable friend that I am deeply disappointed that we only see draft legislation on a new Mental Health Act. The process for a new Mental Health Act was started in 2017. I have said before, I've said once before in debate on the previous Queen's speech, that I feared that we might not see a new Act until 2023. I now fear we might not see a new Act until 2024, and, given the proximity of potential general election, may not see a new Act in this Parliament at all. I have to say that I think those suffering from mental health deserve better from the government, and I would encourage action on introducing a new Mental Health Act. I'm also disappointed we don't have an employment bill, particularly to put through the policy of ensuring that tips that are left for waiters actually get paid to those individuals. It was a popular policy, and I would hope that the government will think again on putting it through. The final issue on which I'm disappointed is that we don't see a commitment to an independent public advocate. This was a 2017 manifesto commitment. I recognise my right honourable friend did not put it in the 2019 manifesto, but it was one of the key recommendations from the report I commissioned from Bishop James Jones. 33 years on from the Hillsborough disaster, I think it is time that we actually took action to provide much greater support for those families who lose loved ones in public disasters, and there have been other disasters since Hillsborough. I think it would be a very fitting legacy for those who sadly have lost the front bench. The government doesn't need to do any work on it because the honourable member for Garston and Halewood actually has a bill that is written and which I'm sure she will be aiming to introduce in this House and which could be supported. Now, my final comment is underlying the government's programme is the desire to level up the economy and encourage high-wage, high-skill jobs. A country that works for everyone is about levelling up opportunity across the country. But the economic background against which the government is working does not make delivering on those aspirations easy. The cost of living crisis is making life difficult for many across the country. We have rising inflation, the need to restore public finances, the number of people who are economically inactive in this country is rising, as well as we've seen a hit to sterling, and forecast growth is well below trend. All those make for a very challenging environment. And it's a time like this that the Conservative principles of sound public finances and competent economic management are needed more than ever. And as we level up across the country, we should ensure that we're a government that doesn't just work for certain parts of the country, but a government that truly works for everyone.
To follow the Right Honourable Lady, especially since the current Prime Minister entered office. And I agreed with a lot of what she said, especially on